I'm Dr. Vincent Baker, the director of the Wheaton College Center for Applied Christian Ethics, and tonight's a very unique situation. And it's unique because tonight's guest is a former professor of mine. So I met Dr. Nigel Cameron when I was a student at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in the early 1990s. And so I took ethics from him. We had many conversations about many things. Dr. Cameron is a man with, his book includes the title, The Many Lives. Arguably, you could say he's been a person with many lives. So before he was at TEDS, he was the warden of Rutherford House, and then he was at TEDS. And then since that time, he's had some other roles, like something that brought him here a number of years ago when he was the chief executive officer for the Center for the Policy on Emerging Technologies. He's also been a technology editor for Unheard.com, a commissioner for UNESCO from 2006-2017, a non-executive director of Genesis Systems, a startup about air-generated water systems, and now he's a biographer. And so, and we have an interesting biography that he's written that relates to Dr. Sierra Koop, who prior to my time as the director of the Center for Applied Christian Ethics, Dr. Koop was involved in work that was related to raising support for the center. So he's going to talk about this biography about Dr. Sierra Koop. And if you're interested in buying a copy of this book, there are copies out there that you can purchase after he is completed. So he's going to lecture, we're going to have some Q&A, and then books are available for you to purchase and for him to sign. And there are also some refreshments as well. And so now it's my great pleasure to introduce my former professor, Dr. Nigel Cameron.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the kind invitation, President Reichen and Vincent. I'm just delighted to be here, making various connections, and I'll talk a little bit about Koop and Wheaton. This isn't just a sort of standard spiel about the book, because there are some very interesting connections with this particular institution. It's also very nice for me to be back here, because I have been here from time to time, and in fact it was Dr. Koop who got me invited here for the first time back in 1992, I think, when he had been asked by the college to chair this National Advisory Council for the Center for Applied Christian Ethics, and he got me added to it. I had no prior connection with the college, and in fact the board was consisting mainly of donors and trustees and so on. So it gave me some really interesting insights into Wheaton over about a decade, as we had a succession of meetings here. And I could also meet with Dr. Koop, and I'll talk a little bit about our relationship as we move along. Indeed, I'll be very happy to sign copies, and one of my reflections as I've signed copies of books over the years is, if this ends up on eBay, does my signing it add to the value or detract from the value? You never quite know what happens to the reputation of books and their authors. So first I want to share three brief statements with you about Dr. Koop. Some of you will know a lot about him, some perhaps less so. Three ways in which three rather significant individuals have sought to sum up his significance. Then I'll say a bit about Koop and college, and then a bit about how I came to write the book, and then I'll talk a bit about his life, both his life as a surgeon, and then about his life as a Surgeon General. So first one or two quotes, and the quotes are from, first of all, David Kessler, whose name many of you will know, who is a former FDA commissioner and a major figure in American public health. He said this about Koop. As he elevated the once obscure post of Surgeon General, Koop was able to achieve far more than even the most powerful cabinet secretary. His role in the 80s. In the obituary published in Atlantic Monthly magazine, by his willingness to rise to the moment, to respond from his faith in God and his powerful belief in his calling as a doctor, as his fellow humans called out from their fear and suffering, C. Everett Koop changed the course of history. And then a comment from Harold O.J. Brown, sadly too early deceased, who was perhaps the smartest ethicist and theologian on the evangelical circuit 30 years ago. A friend of mine, and a friend of Chick Koop's, a critical friend of Koop's during his time in office. Carl F.H. Henry, who was the dean of evangelical theology back in mid-century, said that Joe Brown was the smartest man he'd ever met. So that sets up Joe Brown. And Joe said that Koop was the most significant evangelical in American public life since William Jennings Bryan. Bryan, as I'm sure you know, was a three-time Democrat candidate, the youngest man ever to run for the presidency as a major party candidate. And his reputation somewhat sullied over the years because of that lovely movie, Inherit the Wind, which gives a rather jaundiced version of the Scopes trial. But Joe Brown, the most significant evangelical in American public life since Bryan. Koop began life, of course, as a pediatric surgeon. And before ever he became Surgeon General, he was the world's most celebrated pediatric surgeon. I think without any qualification. He was celebrated on the continent, he was celebrated in Japan in particular, and his pioneering work in pediatric surgery, I'll talk a little about that later, was quite stunning. Not simply as a practitioner, but as the key force in shaping the profession and in shaping professional recognition of pediatric surgery within the American medical establishment. But one or two comments about Koop and the college. Koop's daughter, Betsy, was a student here, and she was graduating in 73, I think 73. But in 73, the college invited her famous dad, who was then famous among evangelical Christians as a physician, to speak at commencement. And the usual pas de deux, he would be given an honorary degree and so on. And Koop was given this invitation and immediately asked his lawyer in Philadelphia to get him a copy of the judgment in Roe versus Wade, which had been handed down, of course, earlier in 1973. Of course, back then it was a bit difficult to get these things. You had to find pieces of paper and they had to be mailed to you. And so he got his lawyer to work. And when Koop came here to make this commencement speech, he began by saying that typical commencement speech is all about pulling up your socks and all that sort of thing. And he said, I'm not going to do that. And he used this occasion to launch the evangelical pro-life movement. It was a thunderous attack on abortion, and it caused great embarrassment, I suspect, to the college, as we did not publish or in any way promote the speech that he had made. It was never fully published. It's sitting there in the archives over the road. And 3 years later, he wrote a book, which was basically an expansion of the speech which he had given. Not many evangelicals remember or believe that back in 1973, very few evangelicals were concerned about the abortion issue. Most regarded it as a twin to contraception. It was a Catholic question, Catholics were over there, was one of their issues. And some evangelicals, notably the eminent Southern Baptist W.A. Criswell, were really quite enthusiastic and said that until the baby is born, this is not a problem. There's an interesting volume published by the Christian Medical Association, Society, they changed their names once or twice, full of essays, and the consensus of these essays was that there are moral issues here, but that evangelicals do not need to take a pro-life position. So, history. After Koop left office as Surgeon General in 1989, the college was keen to get him involved in other things. And he was invited by the then president to chair this advisory board, national advisory board for the Center for Applied Christian Ethics. And he agreed to do this. And he developed a touching friendship with Alan Johnson, who was then directing the center, and whom I was very friendly with, a very, very sweet and gracious man, and his wife. And in the archives, in the case archives, there's an exchange of notes between them on birthdays and holidays and so on, after they both ceased to be involved with Case. And Koop ends, probably the last of these, by saying, "I think we'll meet again on the other side." A biography. There's a wonderful short book, classic book for those who write biographies, by a man called Paul Murray Kendall, who writes about the nature of biography in his classic lectures. And he summarizes the biographer's task in a way that I found very helpful to me as I went about this project. The task is to perpetuate a man as he was in the days he lived, a spring task of bringing to life again. It is to mark, to keep alive, the passage of a man by recapturing the life of that man. And as I have gone about writing the biography over a period of about 5 years, and as I like to say, 2 years of that was seriously full-time, I've had in mind not simply writing a book, not simply commemorating a man whom I admired and was friendly with, but bringing him back into the conversation. A generation later, a man who has been quite remarkably forgotten. There were reasons for this. If you want to have people write about you and remember you, I'd suggest don't do two of the things that Koop did. One is live too long. I mean, he passed when he was 96. So there was an awful long time for people to have forgotten about him. And the other was, of course, that he was eclectic. He thunderously launched the evangelical pro-life movement and then worked with Francis Schaeffer and so on and so forth on those questions. He becomes Surgeon General. He sets the abortion issue to the side, disappoints all kinds of people who had expected he would be campaigning on abortion in office, and then becomes celebrated for his work on smoking and AIDS and so on, which we'll talk about later. So the way I would sum this up is that every Koop enthusiast I know wants to add a footnote to their enthusiasm. So whether you're a pro-life enthusiast, or whether you're a member of the gay community, or whether you're an anti-tobacco, I mean, you feel you have to cover yourself by saying, on the other hand, he had other views and did these other things, which we found embarrassing or difficult or distracting. And I think this combination of his extreme age and the eclecticism of his convictions, which have helped to pull him out of the sort of the limelight. And I've interesting comment from Greg Easterbrook, whose name some of you will know, who writes for the New Yorker and so on. He wrote a very fine essay about Koop. And when I interviewed him, he said, "That's the thing I admire the most about him. It's also the reason he's not gone into the pantheon of Washington figures. He's not referenced all that much, because people in Washington have no idea what to make of someone whose motivations are moral. What do you mean you're moral? Who cares about that?" Michael Spector in the New Yorker, who said to me, there was probably no single issue on which he actually agreed with Koop. That's an exaggeration. He described him as the most utterly consistent public servant I have seen. So how someone who is regarded that way, Spector writes for New Yorker and so on, is a very significant interpreter of contemporary culture in the Washington context, how someone admired like that can disappear from the Washington scene and very largely from the evangelical scene. And I'll say that my book was reviewed in Christianity Today, in interesting terms. The first version of it was taken down when I pointed out it was full of inaccuracies. Second version stayed up for all problems, but he was framed as Koop, the man who disappointed evangelicals by not campaigning on abortion, which seems to be one of perhaps half a dozen different subsets of the significance of the man, and of the significance of the man who, I think Joe Brown is right, was the most significant evangelical in American public life in two generations. So, having said that, how I came to write the book, I wasn't planning in kind of retirement to be writing biographies, but Koop came into my mind. He passed in 2013, and he came into my mind just before COVID hit. Something reminds you of somebody who you haven't thought about for, I don't know, probably for a year or two. And so, of course, Google has all the answers. And back in those days, it was only Google, it wasn't ChatGPT had all the answers. And nothing at all. And it's extraordinary, really. When he died, these huge obituaries, all dropped, which had been written, drafted 20, 30 years before, the way the press does these things. And then, absolute nothing. And I think maybe someone's written a biography, or someone's, I mean, nothing. I thought, one has to check, because biographies, they're famous for being sort of subterranean activities. People can spend a decade writing a biography. And so I thought, I know who would know, and that is Tony Fauci. Because I'd met Fauci a few times at conferences at Aspen and so on, and we discovered that we were both friends of Koop's. And obviously he was an associate of his, but he was actually a strong personal friend after their time in office, after Koop's time in office. And so I can tell this was just before COVID, because Tony, who is one of the world's leading workaholics, and he was then 78 or something, was still doing his own email. So I was able to get through to him directly. A few months later, I would never have got through to him with all of these secretaries and so on and so forth. And he said, no one has talked to me about writing about Koop. And so we then had several interviews and discussed it, and he was very, very helpful in shaping some of his own memories about Koop. And I came to a kind of, I think it was clearly vocational view. And I pulled out of some other things that I was doing because of the seriousness with which I took this project. I thought somebody is going to write about Koop. I mean, he is a major figure. In the late 1980s, some polling said that he was the best known figure in the United States government after Ronald Reagan. He was a celebrity in the late 80s. And somebody will write about him. And it will likely be somebody who sees him in the Washington context, who is not particularly interested in his background as a pediatric surgeon, who is not particularly interested in his faith. Almost all discussions of Koop in the Washington press dismiss him as a fundamentalist. That's the term they use. He was a fundamentalist, but mercifully, he didn't take his faith all that seriously and apply it to his work in government. Apparently, fundamentalists are meant not to be concerned about the lives of gay people and smokers and so on and so forth, but this is the way the mind works. I think it's Easterbrook who wonderfully says that church-going among the Washington press corps is about as common as line dancing. and there may be a strong statistical correlation there. So I thought someone needs to do this who can understand a little of who he was, why he was, how he came to these particular positions, and what makes sense of his time in office. Because it was full of surprises, but they weren't necessarily random surprises. There's a structure behind the way in which he decided to do things, like not addressing abortion, and very deliberately going after tobacco, and then finding himself responsible for shaping American policy on AIDS, which was the main thing for which he became most celebrated, and which caused most discomfort for many of his evangelical friends, and indeed for himself. One of his close staff members at HHS said he had a physical revulsion when confronted with the notion of homosexual activity. But this was part of who he was. But, as he would say, I'm a doctor. And he would love to give the illustration. When he was a young surgeon, there's a bank robbery. And he's presented with a bank robber who's been shot and a cop who's been shot. And he says, I just do triage. I don't start with the cop. That's not my job. I'm a doctor. And he sat down with these gay leaders when it came to the AIDS issues, and he said, I've spoken to a number of these people who mostly survived the epidemic. And he said to them, I don't like what you do. But God is the judge. I'm a doctor. I'm going to save your life. So I think there are ways of making sense of Koop, but I think there's been a lot of caricature among those who have seen him, seen the contradictions in him as if they were actual contradictions, rather than different facets of a complicated man. And I mean, for example, there's a general view that his evangelical supporters were very unhappy about the AIDS report. Because it was full of discussion of condoms and sex education and things of this kind. Whereas Jerry Falwell, you don't get much more sort of out there on the right than Jerry Falwell. Jerry Falwell, I mean, gave him his pulpit and so on to address the issue, but he wrote to him a very warm letter, which I've read, which is in the archives, saying how much he supported his stand as a Christian for science and for medicine in the context of the AIDS controversy. Now, there were others like Phyllis Schlafly and people, of course, on the Catholic right, who were very condemnatory of his approach. And there were politicians who wanted people with AIDS to be tattooed. They wanted people with AIDS to be sent to Alaska and in camps. I mean, there was talk of this kind, and they terrified these young gay men. But Koop cut through all of this. And the response from Christians was a lot more supportive than I think a lot of even historians have suggested. It's interesting, when you spend several years reading all the actual original papers, you do come up with a somewhat different view of how things moved, and particularly how things fit together. So, that by way of introduction. I want to say 5 things about his career before he was Surgeon General, which may be of interest, and just briefly. But he had ambitions which are really quite intriguing. When he was an undergraduate, and he went up to college when he was to Dartmouth when he was 16. In English 101, they were asked to write an autobiographical essay, and we have Koop's. It's in the file. And he said, I have, age 17, he says, I have great aspirations of being not only a medical doctor, but one of the greatest surgeons of my time. He wasn't a modest kid, but that's what he stated when he was 17. What is very striking after he becomes a pediatric surgeon, and one of the first, 3, 4, 5 full-time pediatric surgeons in the United States. Until then, almost all pediatric surgery was done by general surgeons, which is one reason why it was deeply ineffective, and nobody liked operating on small children, partly because essentially they were amateurs. Koop was instructed by his boss at the University of Pennsylvania, Michael I.S. Ravdin. Ravdin was probably the most important surgeon in America during the 1950s. And Koop had the great good fortune during the war years and after to be working in his department. And he and a colleague decided to offer Koop the job of surgeon-in-chief of the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, the nation's oldest children's hospital. And I was able to visit there quite recently and made a speech at the College of Physicians. And was shown around the new hospital. I mean, they have a new wing going up with 600 beds in it. This is an enormous. Well, Koop laid the foundations for the celebrity of the Children's Hospital. And Rafton had said, you will do this, and you will only specialize, you'll specialize in pediatric surgery. You will not do any other surgery. And I think you can succeed. And this was a whole fresh approach in American surgery. And what is fascinating is at the same time as he was specializing and focusing and building this program, he was very widely involved in the American Academy of Pediatrics doing other things. He was on a committee on cancer. He was leading a project in developing standards for burns care. Another project he was leading was the key effort to take X-ray machines out of children's shoe shops, which I remember as a child, and which were then very common. They didn't do much harm to the kids unless they bought an awful lot of shoes, but they did a lot of harm to the staff. Koop spearheaded that. The issue of accident is fascinating. He said, and it is still the case today, that when children have an accident, people pick them up and carry them around. They would never dream of doing so with an adult who had the same accident. So he led this. So he led all of these things sort of in parallel to what he was doing at the Children's Hospital. It is really rather remarkable. I mean, I've read the minutes of the American Academy of Pediatrics. It's all there. There was a downside to this, which meant he was never home, but we may talk about that in a bit. I draw in the book several what I call patient vignettes, and I'll read one of them to you because, there was something extraordinary about Koop. There were issues with his ego and other things of this kind, but Koop as a physician could really be quite extraordinary. So I'll read you this account. A family friend, Carl Lingle, who told me this, who was still with us in Philadelphia at some great age. In 1976, family friend Carl Lingle and his wife were expecting a baby. They'd previously lost 3 in succession to miscarriage and stillbirth. She called her husband to tell him the baby was coming, this time 11 weeks premature. Koop had told them to call him at any time. He also referred the Lingles to the high-risk pregnancy unit at the University Hospital, and his colleague, Dr. Maria Papadopoulos, who was in charge. They used to have big disagreements about the aggressive care Koop would give to handicapped babies, but she was in charge of the high-risk unit. So Lingle called Koop, but was told he just left town to give a lecture. He called Papadopoulos. She was on vacation. So Lingle arrived at the hospital, he told me, at the same time as the ambulance, and he prayed a silent prayer. Lord, please don't give us another dead baby. Then a woman walked in wearing a sweatshirt and jeans, and Lingle snapped at her, "Who are you?" Expecting her, he told me, that she was a psychologist or something such. "I am Maria Papadopoulos. Dr. Koop called me back from vacation." He said, "You needed me." Lingle left the room for some fresh air, and as he walked down the hall, he spied walking toward him the trademark bow tie and beard of Dr. Koop. "I thought you were on your way to New Hampshire." Koop replied, "I've come back and I'll stay with you." 21 years later, Lingle shared this story at Messiah College. And Lingle's little girl, born that day at 3 pounds 6 ounces, was a student in the audience. Well, there are many of these stories, but Koop's character comes through. Koop wrote a famous article. This is the first time I think he became famous beyond pediatric circles and sort of church doctor physician circles. He wrote an article in Reader's Digest called "What I Tell the Parents of a Dying Child." And at the close of this Reader's Digest article, he shares his practice with dying children in the Children's Hospital. He gives parents a choice of having their child stay in the hospital or at home. They usually want their child at home, but there may be special circumstances, like younger children, that lead them to decide to leave the child in the hospital. In that case, Koop says, "I will be in the hospital when the child dies." This often means spending nights there, but he says this is of little importance when balanced against the comfort it gives to parents to know that their child has not been abandoned. 2 months after that article appeared, Koop's son David would die alone on a New Hampshire mountain. Fifth snippet I've called Another Koop. When Koop was running, as it were, to be Surgeon General in the huge furore in Washington about his appointment, because of course he was regarded as a pro-lifer and as somebody with no experience of public health, and Surgeon General is meant to be an expert in public health. The hospital in Philadelphia helped prepare a memo with the White House about his experience in areas that might be regarded as public health and certainly would have no particular connection with pediatric surgery. So I'll read a snippet from this. They drafted this memo. It was dismissed by the head of the American Public Health Association as dressing up events which can hopefully be sold to this committee as experience in public health. Actually, it's rather remarkable. And some of you may know this. I mean, he worked hand in glove with his good friend Ray Knighton to establish what was then called the Medical Assistance Program and later MAP International. Time of the confirmation, it was the largest international relief agency in the US after the Red Cross. He made contributions to public health during World War II as surgical consultant to a team assigned to investigate hepatitis during the Allied invasion of Italy. In 1960, he worked with the State Department to establish a medical school in Ghana. 1965, he worked again with the State Department to build a hospital in Hong Kong. And then he helped the government of the Dominican Republic stamp out an epidemic of diarrhea with a mortality rate of between 50 and 70%. He established clinics in the Dominican Republic, organized hydration stations. And Koop later reminisced, I really did a lot to establish pediatric anesthesia also. Amusingly, he was once introduced to an audience at a Japanese medical conference as the leading expert on pediatric anesthesia, which was not in fact his specialty. He had this wide range of interests, which gave him a good deal more credibility than his public health critics wish to suggest. His being selected by the Reagan administration to become Surgeon General became highly controversial. But it became controversial in ways that were not expected. So as soon as he got to Washington to go through this grueling process of about 9 months before the formal hearings, he told everybody who wanted to listen that he was not going to use his appointment to talk about abortion. Now this is, in fact, I mean, it is funny among other things. The only reason he was picked for the job was because he was the best known evangelical opponent of abortion, and the Reagan administration, which made a lot of other mainline Republican appointments, wanted to please the social conservative base. I mean, it's as simple as that. And I was talking to somebody who was involved with the process to make the appointment. And I asked her, when they were interviewing him, would they not have discussed with him what he was going to do once he became Surgeon General? And she said it's entirely possible they never did. They kind of assumed he would just carry on making speeches about abortion. And they were more concerned about things like, do you agree with the president's agenda? Do you have management experience? And these sort of background questions. But he immediately said, I won't talk about this, and one essay about him put it in these terms: everybody, both if you like the liberals and the conservatives, regarded this as an election day promise to get him through the hearing. But of course it wasn't. It was a decision. And Koop, and I think he was a naive man in a number of ways, and I do discuss this in the book. I think he never really understood why he had been picked to be Surgeon General. I think he really thought this was a kind of promotion from being a famous pediatric surgeon into becoming the top person in public health. It was a kind of sideways upward move into a new field. I think that was how he regarded it. I don't think he ever got that out of his head. And he was just perplexed when people began complaining about the fact he wasn't campaigning on abortion, or saying how glad they were he wasn't. But he said, I've done that, I've written books, this is a new job. And what he did in office, very briefly to sum it up, he cut smoking by nearly 1/4 in the United States. It was going down, but you look at the graph, it goes down, and then quite remarkable. Which is why, of course, smoking now among people who've been to grad school in the US, I think it's 1-point-something%. In Europe, smoking is still, 25, 35% in most European countries. And this was Koop. And you can read the anguished discussions of the tobacco lobbyists in the files, because they say, this is Koop. He has done this. The Baby Doe case, huge controversy about a handicapped child who was born handicapped and was not treated. It was put in a corner, this is what they used to do, and the child would die from dehydration. And this blew up into an enormous cause célèbre during the Reagan administration. Koop was not actually involved with this case for the first year or so of it. They kept him out of it, but he finally got involved, and he brokered a compromise. And a lot of the pro-lifers weren't happy with the fact he brokered a compromise. Every baby unit had to have a sign-up saying, this is the number you call if you think babies are not being treated enough. And this was the initial approach. The court struck that down. Koop brokered a compromise. But the third, and the reason why he became such a celebrity, of course, was the AIDS report. So 1986, okay, AIDS has been going since 81. It came in the same time he was candidating to be Surgeon General. He and Fauci were both reading these, the morbidity and mortality reports, which I believe have been suspended, or they were recently, which basically are the way communicable diseases are reported through the CDC system. They were both separately reading these documents in their offices in Washington about the small numbers of homosexual men who were very healthy and then suddenly got very sick. And Koop was getting interested in this, and he and Fauci became friends. It's very curious. At one point I was speaking to Tony Fauci, he said, look, I'm in the same office now that I was in back then, because he stood down a couple of years ago. And he said, out the window I can see Koop's house, because Surgeon General gets a house on the NIH campus. And Koop would go home in the evenings and stop by, because Tony was always working late, and they would talk about AIDS, year after year. Until finally in '86, Koop was asked to write the report. And it was assumed by the White House that he would come out with something which was pretty moralistic, and saying, well, it's obviously IV drug users and primarily homosexuals who are getting AIDS, and bad, and you should, abstinence, and so on and so on. And Koop is very powerful. He sat down with the leaders of the gay community. For example, Jeff Levy, who's now a retired professor from one of the Washington universities, and who was at a conference where I was speaking about Koop a week or two ago. And he was then the policy guy for the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force. And he sat down with Koop and he said, we didn't believe him. He said, I'm a doctor, I want to save your lives. We said, this, and we suddenly discovered that he actually was telling the truth. And so they produced this report, which of course was extremely controversial, which set the tone for US AIDS policy and for global AIDS policy. And Michael Gerson, whom some of you will know, very sadly died young, a Wheaton man, who was George W. Bush's chief speechwriter, was very much involved in the shaping of PEPFAR, the President's emergency program for AIDS, which I believe has now been suspended, but that is another question, which has saved at least 25 million African lives. And Mike Gerson said, without Koop, it's hard to see how this would have happened. Because he basically pulled the Republicans into the view, this is a huge public health crisis, and we have to have a secondary consideration of some of the moral issues and the general, of course, anti-gay issues and so on. It's whatever one takes of some of these debates, I find one of the most interesting facts is that Obama ran the first time as an opponent of gay marriage. That American social mores have changed very rapidly. That, I think, helps you understand how the atmosphere was back then for those within the gay community. One Senate staffer, there was a Senate staffer who knew the Koop family personally back in back in Philly, and then ended up working with Koop when he was on Capitol Hill, 30 years later. And he told me, he said he was in an office in the Senate in the middle of these developments. And Jesse Helms, the arch conservative, the patron saint, I call him, of the tobacco lobby and so on, was in earnest debate with another member of the Senate. And he said they were discovering in this conversation that Chick Koop was pro-life after birth as well as before birth, which I think nicely captures some of these discussions. Well, final comment, then we can maybe have a little Q&A. Koop made mistakes. To give you an example, his two surviving sons did not attend his second wedding. He got married, his wife had died, he got married when he was 93 to a young lady who was nearly in her 60s then, Cora Hope, who has become a good friend of mine in this process. And his two surviving sons would not attend the wedding. His one surviving son now, there was a special conference at Dartmouth 2 weeks ago around Koop and the book and his relevance for today. His one surviving son, who actually is on the fringe of the Dartmouth faculty, he has taught history on the North, he refused to come to the conference. One can make various conclusions from some of this behavior, but Koop was just never there when his kids were small. He would be in the hospital nights on end, and he would do things that were not necessary, which were extraordinarily valuable but not necessary. And so on Sundays, which was the main day off he would have, after dinner, after midday dinner, he would go off and work with teams of students on Philadelphia's Skid Row. And he was often there till midnight. And he regretted this in our later life. I don't think he regretted it enough, or he quite saw the incredible difference between the experience his children had of their father and the experience he had had of his father. He was an only child, and his father, whom he called his best friend, his father would spend many of his lunch hours in New York City going to the New York Public Library to look up in encyclopedias answers to the questions being raised by his son, who was always asking questions. That was the kind of relationship he had with his father. He had grandparents in the apartment upstairs who owned the house, more relatives down the street. Very much the blue-eyed boy. And he bought, when he had money to afford this, a farm up near Hanover. And they would spend a month there every summer. And he would say, that's the family time. We'll be there for a month. That's when the kids can have access to their father and do all these fun things. And I don't think the kids ever saw it like that. And so you end up with these, with this distancing later in life, and even now, because he did not build the kind of relationship with his kids that he should have. Well, as I engage in this task, I say, what is the value of biography? And I'm now halfway through writing another biography. This is how we learn our life lessons, by examining the lives of people whom we admire or who certainly are admirable in certain respects, and discovering how they also have, well, the term biographers like to use is feet of clay, because it's a somewhat misapplication of that phrase in the book of Daniel, but that the fallenness of our human nature comes out, I think, very plainly when we begin to examine these narratives of the lives of others, and of course when we begin to learn lessons for the lives of ourselves. Well, thank you very much, and be happy now to have some discussion.
You can direct your questions from here to Dr. Cameron.
So I teach public health here. I've been waiting for your book to come out. So I'm so glad this out. As you say, there's not a lot online about Koop, so I've been using an article of of yours somewhere online. I don't remember where that mentioned you were writing a biography. But I talk about Koop in one of my public health classes because I can think of no better example of someone just unapologetically bringing their faith into public life in a way that actually blesses other people and, within public health we're concerned with the saving of lives. It's interesting to hear you talk about how he was very human and flawed in some ways. And when I teach about him, I always ask myself, what do I want my students to take out of this? Because he was larger than life. I mean, I saw him speak 2010 at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health well into his 90s, and he was still just so much larger than life. And I think, we're not all Koop. So I think one thing I want my students to take away is that excellence earns you the right to speak, and that's something I think he talked about. Well, an interview he did with Case years ago, he talks about that, how that opened doors, just people respecting his just professional brilliance and achievement, even if they didn't like all of his views. So that's one thing I want my students to take away, but I'm curious, what else, as I talk about his life, what else should my students be taking away from his life in terms of just, public witness and service in public life?
One of the themes of Koop is, if you like, the inconsistencies, or at least the things that are surprising. And I think they're all worth examining. And I could have done a chapter on it. I didn't do this. Just going through them all. So I mean, for example, back in the 40s and 50s, and this was a social conservative. I mean, obviously he was fighting what we now call ableism. This was at the heart of his view of these handicapped children, and he had this incredible affection for them. And he writes very powerfully about the love of parents for their own children. He said there are occasional examples where parents wanted to get rid of their children, didn't want to have them, and so on. And he set up an adoption service himself to cope with those children. But he said almost all the parents he dealt with, and their children with all sorts of weird deformities, but parents just adored the children. And it never occurred to them it would be a problem to take care of them. But ableism was, we now frame this in those terms. But also, he had a Jewish friend. Now, this was the days of anti-Semitism among professional classes, very, very powerful. And this guy was being considered for a position at a children's hospital on the West Coast. And he was invited in a little anteroom, went for an interview, invited into a little anteroom by somebody else who said, I want to explain this to you, doctor, thank you so much for coming, just that you will not be getting a job because we already have our Jew. And he checked it for Koop. And of course, Koop hit the ceiling and wrote to the entire board of the hospital, who wrote back and told him to mind his own business, but the guy got the job. He admitted a black child to the private ward in the hospital, and nurses resigned because there were no black children in the private ward. And this is a bit of a mystery, but of his first, maybe dozen trainees, and he would have 1 or 2 a year, I think 5 were women. At a time when there were very few women in surgery. And he didn't continue that practice. There were 1 or 2 later, but this was right early on. This is just an extraordinary way of putting the pieces together. And then you add his, rather arrogant sort of self-determination. He was also depressed, and this is something that no one had written about. Now, he was depressed at the end, and we know that because there was statements in his memorial service. But I found a paper from mid-50s when, he'd been at the hospital for 10 years and so on, in which he was writing down, he'd write his little memos to self, and some of them survived. And it was obviously clinical depression. People don't want my services. I'm thinking now of getting a job in administration or in general surgery. He was writing this down in the mid-50s. And I think he had a very private life. The point I make in the book is you can read his memoir after he stood down. A certain general, written by his son Alan, who he got out of Dartmouth for a year to write the book and paid him for it, who wouldn't come to the event 2 weeks ago. There's nothing about his personal life. He writes about his faith, but it's very formalistic. And plainly he was given to fits of depression. And he was very thin-skinned. You never guess that by the loudness of the man. He was really very upset when, during the controversy about the hearings, and people who are controversialists don't get upset. Those of us who spent part of our lives fighting causes, we get annoyed and we fight back, but he was really upset and hurt by criticism. So there's a sensitivity there. And the other comment I make is that he was politically naive, and I think that naivety lasted right through. He wanted to be made Secretary of Health and Human Services. He wanted to be Kennedy's job. And he thought he deserved this because he'd done well as Surgeon General. It was the next promotion. In fact, he would go 2 or 3 steps. And he lobbied for this position as the incoming Bush administration, George H.W. Bush. I think it was Fauci who said that nobody else in Washington thought he would get it. And one of his very close advisors, who really was very candid with him, simply said to him, "You don't understand. To become a secretary, you need to be a governor, or you need, to have some major cause constituency behind you. The constituency that got you the job as Surgeon General, you have broken with them, and they don't like you anymore." And someone made the comment that one way of looking at this is that he got the job as Surgeon General because of his pro-life position, and he lost it and left government. His position expired, but he left government and didn't get another job precisely because of his position on abortion, because he considered it was a discussion he didn't want to have anymore. So you see his internal stuff. Another comment I made is that he was intensely generous. And he had this very, very powerful reflex of generosity, which is a curious thing in a man who he was certainly arrogant and in many ways, and he became more so later on. But I mean, he early on, I mean, when he was at Philly, he set up a charity and working with an Indian tribe in Mexico, and he built a series of clinics for them. He raised the money, put in his own money, went down to Mexico. And he did all sorts of things like this, and he set up this charity for adoptions. And then later on, I have a wonderful story. He had a personal aide who was very generous with his time and his memories in his last years, Lester. And Les said that he was Koop was sitting in church one Sunday, and behind him, he was probably late 80s or so, behind him there was a family. And the parents were talking to their daughter, and she wanted to go to nursing school. And they said, "Oh, really sorry, we just can't afford it." So he turns around and says, "Hello, I'm Dr. Koop." He said, "Give me a note of the nursing school. I'll pay the tuition. I'll give them a call. I'll give them a call tomorrow." Now, stories. Lester said, she and her family go to the church where I played the organ. He was an organist. He says they go to that church. This is 20, 30 years later. And he put various people through school like that. It's probably also did him to his sons, but there you are. But he obviously had a certain amount of result. And so, I mean, you look at the character of the individual. But it was, he locked himself in by being so bumptious and so full of himself. He had an advisor who knew him personally a bit, but who was hired as an advisor, who worked with people like the Kardashians when their reputation was in difficulty. That was the guy's job. I've spoken to this fellow. He said, I said to him, "I can't bring back the 1980s when you really were famous. I can't do this, He would say, "I just want to be Koop," because Koop was the great authority. And he should have been kicking back, and he talked about writing a medical mystery. He should have done that. He should have played with his grandkids, but he just wanted to be the great man. And so Ken Larter, who gave the homily at the National Memorial Service, where they had all the bands and the flags and stuff, I mean, just said he was horribly depressed in his final years. So longer answer than your question.
Thank you.
Tell me else, or I'll just read the book. Yes, sir.
You mentioned earlier today that Koop resisted the move of the 10th Presbyterian Church out to the Presbyterian Church of America, and that's something I knew from sort of esoteric interest in American Presbyterian history. But do you think that desire to stay with the mainline Presbyterian had anything to do with his approach to public service, to want to be in the mix where real decisions were made with lots of people and lots of influence?
I think the answer is no, although I see where you're going with that. and the answer is a little disreputable, because he was deeply offended that he hadn't been asked about this early in the process. He thought that Jim Boyce had pushed him out of his position as a sort of chief layperson, well, he was an elder, but chief layperson at 10th, which he'd been sort of handed, by Barnhouse back in the 50s. He was Barnhouse's man in the congregation. And Jim Boyce comes in, this young man, and they became quite close. But he writes to Schaefer. Very interesting. There's Schaefer-Koop correspondence at the National in the National Library of Medicine. The Schaefer guys should get it. They should read it. They don't know about it. Very personal stuff. And he's telling Schaefer, of all people, Schaefer the separatist, how angry he is about this. And he says that basically Jim Boyce has sort of pushed him to the side. And so I think it was very personal. But I think at the same time, the nature of his faith, he was he was a great controversialist. I think his sort of approach to theology was very naive. And he had a number of his Christian friends write about this, about the way he regarded the death of his son, and about the way in which, because he and his wife co-wrote, he wrote, I'm sure, a short book about his son's death, published about 10 years later. And it's a very harsh book. God just decided to do this, and we have to live with it. That's pretty much what it says. And one of his former colleagues, trainees, who is a Stephen minister, which is a Presbyterian sort of non-stipendiary role, he said, I didn't give this book to people dealing with bereavement. He said, Koop just took a different view. And in fact, the same person said, it made it very difficult that his wife was ill for many years and bedridden for some of that time. And it was very hard because he said, God is doing this to me. So he was theologically, I think, very, very naive. But yes, it was. So I think it was a big interpersonal, a big sort of personal offence issue there, rather than a strategic issue. I don't think Koop thought much about things like ecclesiastical politics, and of course he didn't actually understand Washington politics for a start. But it is interesting. He pulled away from it. He stopped going to tents when he was in Philadelphia. He broke friendships. And Linda Boyce, the widow of James Montgomery Boyce, who is still with us and was really very helpful to me in the book, she said that, after a couple of years, things settled down and they became friends again. But it was a big breach for him.
So, he's a great man and a complicated man. If someone said, should I admire C.F. Koop, or should I be like C.F. Koop, what would you say?
I think we are schooled in our celebrity culture, in which people have personal brands, and this, of course, goes way back, not least in the evangelical church, where we have heroes and heroines, into having a sort of one-dimensional view of people, every one of whom is a sort of Jekyll and Hyde. And the feet of clay are always there, and sometimes they become embarrassingly obvious. And just to throw out an example, I don't want to offend, I don't really care if I'm offending people past that stage in my life, but the great Donald Gray Barnhouse. Now, he doesn't have a biography, which is a shame. I think he certainly deserves one. Actually, there's a letter in the Presbyterian Historical Society about about the possibility of a biography, and there were 5 people who did different points, did a bit or tried to or something or other. But Bill Erdmans himself, whom I used to know in the old days, said, well, he's a major minor figure. I think Barnhouse is a bit more than that. However, I've read Barnhouse files. He used to beat his wife. On one particularly horrific occasion, he ran a cold bath, carried her upstairs, stuck her in it, and held her down, while her mother, who was there, tried to get towels and pull her out. One time when his second child was perhaps 2 weeks old, he was crying, took off the diaper and spanked him. "That'll beat out the old man," he said in the evangelical speech. So, what do you do with this? I mean, Barnhouse was an extraordinary figure who had a very powerful role, particularly among the Reformed evangelicalism, but also more broadly. He was the world's first ever preacher on network radio in 1928. What do you do with these things? Obviously, what do you do? I mean, I don't think, writing this, one of my anxieties, I have to say, discovering what it means to be a biographer, was that I might find scandal. And what would I have done had I found scandal? It's interesting, I've discussed this and I hang out with biographers. I mean, and the general view is, unless something was set up in court, you don't talk about it, if it's a serious reputation damaging thing. I mean, you really have to have serious evidence before you go to town on someone's reputation. But, I mean, there were people who would not speak to me. I think he made women uncomfortable in certain circumstances. I'm quite sure he made all sorts of inappropriate remarks. He was an old guy from an old time where things were a bit different in the way in which one conducted oneself, and he was pretty uninhibited. He had a lot of confidence in himself. And I wonder what people who declined to speak to me might have told me, why they didn't want to speak to me. So it is a very complex thing when you get very close to somebody, and when you end up, and this is the sort of rather bizarre feeling I have of meeting members of the family, that I know a great deal more about this man than his children do. And of course, only a slice of what I know is in here. It's a mere 150,000 words. I could certainly have written 300,000 or 400,000 words. So, I mean, it's an interesting question, what is taking place? Because the biographer is really sort of judge and jury. I mean, this is I finally, hit send, and this is how the world will view Chick Koop. What I did toward the end, I didn't want to end with his death, so I have a chapter seeking to assess him with a lot of quotes from people about him. And then with some series of paragraphs of kind of assessment of different aspects of his life. And I got half a dozen of those who knew him best, not family members, who knew him best, to read that chapter. Now, obviously, I had people read all this material, about 30 people read different parts of it, just for assessing historical reliability and so on. But I specifically asked these half a dozen people to read this chapter of assessment. And whether they basically thought it was fair. And one or two did not, and we made one or two changes, and I asked one of them to write one or two paragraphs that could be added, because he thought I was a bit harsh. But this is a complexity, and so I mean, I was really very pleased I did not discover, sort of the sort of ticking bomb here. I think it was pretty much what you see is what you get, and he was a difficult man. I mean, there's a famous, this is famous, inside baseball, Nigel talking to himself, but Paula Absel, who was produced the PBS Nova series for 150 years. I actually met Paula one time. I was introduced by a friend in Washington who said, "Now this could be very important for you, Nigel. This is Paula Absel." It wasn't. When he stepped down, they had a Nova all about him called the Difficult Dr. Koop or the Something Dr. Koop. And oh my goodness, this is absolute panegyric from start to finish. And they followed him to Europe and this and that and the other. Oh my goodness, he was so happy with this. And he wanted to award, he loved awarding medals to people. And so he had this Koop medal, which was only to be appointed personally by the Surgeon General and all this stuff. And he wanted to award this medal to the two women who produced the program, the actual producer and the secondary person. And something like, for services to the Surgeon General. I mean, he loved all this rather pompous sort of talk, And so I think he called up Paula Absel, and she said, "Well, I'll think about it." And she wrote to him, and basically said, "Well, actually, this is journalistic ethics 101. There could be nothing of value could be given to anyone working editorially or any research producer." And he hit the roof. he wrote her, it's files and I quote a bit of it, he wrote her this absolutely furious letter saying, sort of, how dare you suggest that I would want to influence your editorial content, that I would be, somehow trying to warp your decision making. I'm above these considerations. I do not deserve to be judged as other men are. And really, it is quite ridiculous. And you can, well, I think you say in the book that I'm quite sure Paula Apsel, when she opened the letter, began to wish she'd made a more journalistically responsible program about him, rather than just praising him to the skies. So yeah, those sort of raw sort of nerves here and there. But of course, when you get to know Koop a bit, this is just the kind of man he was, and it was not always very fortunate. Yes, sir?
A lighter question, did he resent being called Chip, which stands for chicken coop?
Okay, we have a story. Actually, one of my daughters and her husband have a chicken farm, so I always think about Koop when I go see him. His father and grandfather apparently were called Chick as a nickname when they were kids, and they got rid of it when they got older. He was called Chick when he was in college. And he told me this himself. He said that when he went to med school at Cornell, he was going to, become Chuck or, some Charles, or maybe Everett. The family still called him Everett, the close family. And so he gets to Cornell, and he's at some, freshman, whatever sort of activity, and he hears this guy yelling, "Hey, Chick Koop!" And he knew it was over. And so he adopted it. And it's quite funny, when he visited me in Edinburgh, I mean, the reason I got to know the guy, I asked him to come and give a lecture rather cheekily in 1985, I was written a letter, he's a great man, I'd heard of him, and I was setting up some events in the UK on bioethics. And back in those days, of course, you had to type, and put it in an envelope and things some of you don't know anything about. It takes you half an hour. So I said, fine, I'll just write, great man. And I get a call. I'm feeling quite taken aback by this. Hey, this is Chick Koop. Oh, I love coming to England. And he said specifically, there are things I can say outside the country more easily than here. So, a year later, bizarrely, on the day he issued the AIDS report, he flew to London and spent just over a week with me. And he was in my office, sort of in Edinburgh, he came up to Edinburgh, and he said, "Oh, you can just call me Chick." Oh, he turns to my assistant, "Hey, you can call me Chick too." And so there were I spoke to two people who refused to call him Chick. One was David Kessler. He said it was just, because they worked very closely together on anti-tobacco stuff for a long time. He said, I just felt I could not call Dr. Koop by his nickname. And the other was Lester, his aide in his final years, who really helped him a lot, into bed, out of bed, driving him around and so on. And he said, and I have this in the book, he said, I only once called him Chick, and that was in prayer 2 days before he died. He said, this guy was military. This is very odd, things go on in the military. He was a church organist in the military. And that made him, he became Sergeant Major. That was his rank. So Chick would call him Captain. And they had this sort of coming and going. So in the end he embraced. Interesting, call him Everett or Ev. I was able to meet with a second cousin. He was very friendly with a cousin in New York City. They were both, I think, only kids. And I discovered her daughter in fact, he met with her out in Seattle. And she told me a story. She said that they play a lot. And anyway, so she was born in New York City, and she said there were four kids, and it was a one-bedroom apartment they were living in. And she said that Everett, I think sometime in the mid-late 60s, just wrote a check for down payment on a brownstone so they could move. And she said he's extraordinarily revered within our family. And nobody else told me that story. Maybe none of us knows the story, but she knew the story. And there's a Wheaton dimension here too, because she was looking to go to a community college in New York City, and he said, no, you should go to Wheaton. And he sent her an air ticket. And he wrote to the then president and said, hey, she's coming to see you, you know. You need to admit her. And they did. And then she ended up being in charge of environmental health for King County up in Washington State. So, Everett.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Cameron.